now available in paperback and e-readers. Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess. The goddess next door takes on the threat of a deadly digital diva driven to destroy the world in this action-packed, all-new Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Revenge of the Cyber Goddess featuring a bonus pin-up and the other 2 books in the Cyber Goddess saga at online bookstores everywhere today. President Biden says he is getting ready to lay out a plan to deal with the rising national crime rates that have exploded all across the country. Now, your President Biden says he wants to do something about the crime and the explosion of gun violence, and he connects it all to the COVID-19 pandemic and the high unemployment that went on when most of the country was forced to shut down as related to the lockdowns of the COVID-19 pandemic. But when I take a critical examination of the rising trend of violent crime, its foundations are not in the COVID-19 pandemic, but they were in policies implemented by left-leaning states before the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, before the COVID-19 pandemic forced the country to lock down, many of these left-leaning states, like here in New York, decided to implement a policy known as bail reform. Now, this bail reform policy that states like New York, Illinois, and other left-leaning states implemented was designed to go out here and reform the bail system and eliminate cash bail for many what they thought to be non-violent offenses. However, many of these individuals who are arrested on these so-called non-violent offenses, this bail that they are given is supposed to ensure that this individual is supposed to return for trial. Unfortunately, many of these leftists thought that the bail was infringing on the rights of many of these defendants. And here in New York, the case of Khalif Browder, a young man who was arrested as related to an allegation of a stolen backpack, this was what led to many people pushing for the campaign for bail reform, because your Khalif Browder, he did not get a speedy trial in 180 days. No, he wound up languishing in the prison system for 3 years, and because he wound up languishing in the prison system for 3 years and did not get a court date until 3 years later, he wound up committing suicide. And this was the reason that here in New York that politicians gave to reform the bail system, because they wanted to give these defendants a chance in order to have their lives and be able to be seen as innocent until proven guilty, and not have to go through the system at Rikers Island and suffer the way they wanted us to believe Khalif Browder did inside of Rikers Island for 3 years. So many of these politicians came up with the plan to reform the bail system and eliminate cash bail for many misdemeanors and even some felonies. Unfortunately, what happened as related to bail reform is that here in New York and many left-leaning states, many of the defendants who said that they wanted to get that chance to get on with their lives until their trial date came, many of these people went on to re-offend. In fact, one individual went on to become such a repeat offender, he actually bragged about the numerous times he had been arrested, arraigned, and then let go by New York City's criminal justice system. And the bail reform all across the country in these left-leaning states wound up being one of the reasons why we had a spike in crime all across the country, because most of these bail reform policies, they just created a revolving door where criminals would get arrested by police, and then the judge would be forced to let them go because there was no bail for these crimes. And in many cases, if there were bail, many of these individuals would have been remanded over to Rikers Island to wait for their court date, and that would have prevented this individual from going out and being able to commit more crimes. Unfortunately, this policy of bail reform, what it did was give many of these perpetrators the incentive to commit more crimes, and that's one of the reasons why we have a spike in violent crime all across the country. Another reason why we started to have a spike in violent crime all across the country was also due to policies that California implemented as related to shoplifting. And this policy, as related to shoplifting, made it where your retailers could not prosecute an individual unless an item was over $900 or more. Now, this policy gave incentive to many people to go into retailers like your Walgreens and go in there and wind up going in there to shoplift and go out here and steal from the store with impunity. And it's been shown on numerous videos of individuals going into many of these Walgreens, going in there, picking up bags of merchandise, and even going into other retailers picking up large bags of merchandise in areas like San Francisco, and then just walking out with nobody to go out here and be able to stop these individuals. And these individuals can't be prosecuted due to this change in the law. And this is also what's leading to a spike in crime all across the country, because many of these individuals, because they know that they cannot be put in jail until the time of their trial due to bail reform, and they know that they cannot be prosecuted for small level crimes, many of these individuals, they feel that they have the incentive to escalate their behavior and participate in more violent crime. Now, as these policies were being put into place, the COVID-19 pandemic was going on, and then as the country was locking down, many of these left-leaning states decided to empty out their jails in an effort to combat COVID-19. And this emptying out of jails is another reason why the violent crime rate wound up spiking, because many of these individuals, they were not put in supervised facilities. Many of these individuals were sent home. And a lot of the people who were sent home, and as related to the jails, many of them had felony charges, and others had extreme felony charges. So we have a lot of criminals running around due to policies in left-leaning states where they decided to go out here and empty out the jails in an effort to combat COVID-19. Now, this is compounded on top of the high levels of unemployment and the nation's declining mental health, because the lockdowns, as related to, again, going out here, and we already had the policies with bail reform, we already had the policies with these liberal things as related to not prosecuting shoplifting, and we had policies as related to letting all of these inmates out as related to jail. We then had a lot of people dealing with a lot of frustration from losing their jobs because half the country was unemployed, and many of these people, they were in these homes by themselves together, and that led to a lot of people having a lot of frustration, and that also led to violent crime like domestic violence, and even in some cases of that domestic violence, people winding up using firearms. But your Joe Biden wants us to believe that he's going to focus on gun violence, but he doesn't want to take responsibility for many of the problems that were created by the policies that were left in place by many of these leftists who were trying to be so progressive by giving many of these criminals a chance, and then not understanding that these policies were put in place because of the crime that exploded during the 70s, the 1980s, and early 1990s. And if it wasn't for the policies put in place by your Republican mayors like your Rudolph Giuliani, as related to the Quality of Life initiative here in New York, cities like New York would be turned back into the wastelands they were. And I grew up in that New York City in those dark days of the 1980s, where crackheads were walking around like zombies and criminals were practically doing whatever they wanted, and citizens were feeling terrorized going out every day, and people felt anxiety basically going to the corner store to get a gallon of milk. And people felt that fear because many of these leftists, they wanted to go out here and give many of these perpetrators a chance. And in their efforts to give the perpetrators a chance at having that better life, these individuals wound up destroying the quality of life for many New Yorkers here in New York. And many of these people forced people to move out of your New York City, and they wound up moving to more conservative red states because they just could not deal with the crime. They could not deal with the violence. And again, the violence in this case can clearly be connected to the policies that leftists wound up implementing, like your bail reform, and like these policies that make it where retailers cannot go out here and prosecute people for things like shoplifting small items. The whole thing about these policies is that it does not set a boundary for many of these criminals. And what happens is many of these criminals, once they see that they can get past one boundary, they push more boundaries, and they go out here and go and escalate their criminal behavior into more violent behavior. And that's why the Rudolph Giuliani Quality of Life Initiative was very effective in combating crime, because catching the individual who has gone out here and is urinating in the street or defecating in the street or smoking on a joint or with an open container usually led to officers finding an individual who usually had a whole bunch of felony warrants, and it kept individuals who would go out here and terrorize neighborhoods off the streets. And this is what led to a decline in crime all across New York City. Unfortunately, many of the leftists, they wanted to go back to the policies of the Ed Koch era, and they wanted to go out here and give those Pookies and Ray Rays a chance, and they took their chance to tear the city back down and bring it back to the days of the 1980s. But Joe Biden wants us to believe he wants to combat the tide of violent crime, but it was his party that created the policies that created the explosion of violent crime all across this country. And it was his party and his cities that are a part of his party that led to the explosion of crime and violence during the days of the George Floyd riots. And what the White House is trying to do right now is get in front of a situation they created, because they know that many of these people on the right, they are looking at this explosion in crime, and they're seeing it as an opportunity to go out here and have a talking point to use against many of these left-leaning candidates in many of these states in the 2022 election. So this isn't really about combating all of the violent crime. This is about the left trying to deflect from many of their policies failing in many of these states, like here in New York, where bail reform was just a complete disaster before the pandemic, and they were forced to partially repeal that bail reform because it was such a failure. However, much of the law is still intact, and it's still wreaking havoc through New York's criminal justice system. And this whole case of Kalief Browder was one that set things off. And the whole thing is, we didn't need bail reform. We needed prosecutors to go out here and try these cases according to our Constitution, because every citizen has a right to a speedy trial, and our citizens are not getting a speedy trial because prosecutors are not processing the cases fast enough, and that's where the big problem lied. So you had many of the leftists thinking, oh, we'll just reform the bail system, but it wasn't the bail system that was the problem. The problem was prosecutors we're not prosecuting these cases and giving your citizens that right to a speedy trial. And that is why many defendants were languishing in court for 2, 3, 4, and 5 years in Rikers Island waiting for trial, because prosecutors were not moving fast enough to get these cases to trial or be able to ensure that a case was brought to trial so that this individual could have their day in court. But your Joe Biden wants us to believe that it's all about so-called gun violence, but it's not about gun violence. It is about a failure of a policy all across this country to reform the bail system, a policy to give a lot of these people, so-called people who are defendants, a chance, like many in California talking about, oh, homeless people steal because they can't have anything. But we have to have a moral position, and we have to have standards, because if we don't have standards, we're not going to have a civilization, because the criminals will take over. And that's what happened in California, where the criminals have practically taken over to the point where retailers like Walgreens are closing up businesses because they are tired of taking losses. And that all of this connects again to all of the violent crime across the country. And again, that crime can be directly connected to many of these leftist policies that gave criminals a door into our society to wind up tearing the country completely apart. Now, if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon, my PayPal, or my Cash App by clicking the link in the description box, because this video will not be monetized, and the only way I can be able to stay on the air is if you go out here and donate to the Patreon, the PayPal, or the Cash App. And if you want to also help out, you can pick up some of my books on the SJS Direct imprint, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, the John Haynes series, and the books of the Spinsterella trilogy. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, John Haynes, Taking Care of Business. The man who rules the world breaks in a brand new partner to help him take care of business in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes series adventure. Get John Haynes, Taking Care of Business at paperback and e-readers at online booksellers everywhere.